Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for our webinar on leveraging campus policies to create a culture of values and accountability. My name is Kimberly Timpf, and I'm the Senior Director of Partner Education in the Higher Ed Division here at EverFi. And again, I'm happy to have you join me today for the third in our series. I have been at EverFi for 10 years. Prior to that, I did alcohol and other drug prevention work for 16 years on a number of college campuses. So happy to be here to share my experiences, not just from prior to coming to EverFi, but also my experience since being here working with a number of campuses and colleges and universities, and being able to see the progress that's been made on some of these very challenging issues. I've truly enjoyed my time and I'm looking forward to sharing some of those insights with you here today. So, excuse me, to begin, I do want to remind folks that our first webinar covered institutionalization, and that was really focused on staffing, funding, and a system-wide commitment to prevention. You then heard from Lauren and Rob about how we, translate resources and commitment into effective programs and policies through effective assessment and planning, which is, of course, which happens in a number of different ways, whether it be through sharing of data, assessing programs, but also through the processes that help us to better understand the programs and policies that work for our campus and vetting those against the research base and what it says. And then today we are hopefully going to provide some perspectives on considerations for the development and implementation of policies that effectively deter behaviors that negatively impact students' ability to succeed in college and beyond. And then next month you will hear from my colleague on programming and the role that programming plays in this process of prevention. So understanding that as we look at this graphic here, these four areas were identified actually by our research team through a real vetting of published research, case studies, and a number of different resources, interviews with practitioners and professionals who've been doing this work for a number of years. So this perspective is really, again, very strongly steeped in the evidence base. And so from that, we determined these four areas. We were able to identify that the research really broke down into these four different areas, and that's where this particular perspective is coming from. And also just to set some expectations, I will not be discussing the content of policies here today, so this webinar really is not about what should be included as part of a sexual assault response policy or what parental notification policy should specifically look like. There are a number of resources that can assist with that. This is about the role of policy, how we should think about and approach the policy development process, and what needs to be considered in the implementation of effective policies on our campuses. So I want to begin by highlighting what has been identified here, what I've identified as kind of the policy challenge. This is from an article written in the Chronicle of Higher Education in December of 2014. Many of you have heard me speak about this or are familiar with this article yourselves. And the writers of the article really begin with the premise that little change has been made. And I do take a bit of exception to that statement because, as I mentioned earlier, I have seen success. Still, the article really does make the point that a critical roadblock to making progress really comes down to where we focus our efforts and our resources. And Bob Salz points to that fact when he mentions that colleges continue to treat alcohol abuse as an individual problem, but the message isn't what changes behavior, enforcement does. In that same article, there was a survey of college administrators that really reinforced that message when it showed that among the campuses surveyed, 98% were doing educational programs on student drinking, while only 7% were focused on creating policies that address environmental factors like cheap and easy access to alcohol. And certainly within that comes, of course, the enforcement issue and consistency of enforcement. For the issue of sexual assault, there are similar challenges, although I would venture a guess that these numbers are almost reversed. Campuses have been so focused on policy and compliance that those opportunities to address environmental factors are only now being realized. And so it isn't a question of reversing where we focus our attention. It doesn't need to be a 7% switch to the 98%. It's really about a balance of what we know works and whether or not that can be unpopular with certain constituencies, understandably, but also, with what is the easiest and least resource intensive. That tends to be the challenge. So certainly there's no shortage of data to highlight the need for policy. United Educators identified the disproportionate amount of assaults and slips and falls and their relationship to both alcohol and sexual assault. And then over on the right, we see an article that was in the Atlantic that article in the Atlantic highlighted the study of insurance claims for Greek organizations, again, noting the involvement of alcohol. And in fact, interestingly, we, in a recent conversation with Peter Lake, Peter said to us, one of the biggest challenges facing campuses today is the inability of many on a campus to recognize that alcohol is the root of virtually all problems on a campus. And until that is acknowledged by people in critical leadership positions, we really will never make progress. And this kind of is echoed in this statement. When it comes to understanding the connection between alcohol and sexual assault, I think campuses are wary of engaging in those conversations about that correlation. And that the word correlation is used very purposely there because it is not causation, but there is such a strong correlation. But that is risky because there is a risk of being perceived as victim blaming. And certainly we need to do better at communicating those connections, which is a conversation and a webinar actually for another day. But we do need to better understand the role that alcohol plays beyond just the issue of consent. And missing from the policy conversation is an understanding that by maintaining inadequate policies, colleges actually create an atmosphere that could potentially condone violence and silence survivors and reduce equal access to the benefits of a college education. So this is all really critical piece to understand when we think about the need for policy. As we look to address these issues through the use of effective policies, we should also first come to an understanding of the role of policy, again, as I touched on previously, but a little bit more even from the perspective of a couple of experts. And this first quote from Tracy Toomey describes a conversation that she was a part of in which campus administrators were discussing this very topic. And she raises an issue that really should be central to any policy discussion when she points out the need to start using policy to protect the rights of all students. Who, she asks, are protecting the rights of students who don't drink or don't drink heavily? And certainly we can't overlook the implications that this has for addressing sexual violence. Again, policy shouldn't live in silos because these issues don't. They're interrelated. If we maintain inadequate alcohol policies, colleges and organizations run the risk of creating environments that do little to ensure the safety of our students and can potentially increase the probability of incidents of sexual violence. If we truly want to make a difference, we not only need effective policy to respond to the incidents of sexual violence, but policies that are focused on creating an environment that prevents sexual violence in the first place. And that's really at the heart of what Tracy is saying here. And it also has implications for the role in supporting the healthy majority. We tend to focus on how our programs support students through alcohol-free options, available space, organizations' mission statements focused on supporting healthy behaviors. All of that is well and good, but if we don't have policies that favor the rights of students who are not behaving in a way that is inconsistent with our community expectations, we're really not protecting our students and actually maybe unintentionally sending a message about our community values around the role of alcohol. And so inadequate policies, contribution to sexual violence, potentially reinforcing alcohol is central to social life. And then also, certainly last but not least, and there are certainly more examples that we could call upon in terms of what inadequate policies can impact. But in a recent study out of University of Wisconsin, researchers identified that how students of color perceive the role of alcohol on campus has a tremendous implication for their academic performance. It impacts their self-esteem, their sense of safety, overall perception of the institution. It is a great study. I highly recommend you look that up. It's called The Color of Drinking, again, out of University of Wisconsin. And this brings us to Robert Chapman's perspective on the critical elements of policy that we need in order to ensure how they guide prevention efforts rather than hinder them. And again, emphasizing that they should showcase science and echo the tenets of mission statements, and that advocating personal, social, and cultural development really helps contribute to what we know about effective policy. So again, it isn't just about how we respond to student behavior, but how we consider its role in preventing high-risk behavior. So what does policy look like on a campus? Well, we assess campuses through a tool called the Alcohol Diagnostic Inventory, Sexual Assault Diagnostic Inventory. And through these tools, we're able to get a sense of what campuses are doing around policy and also how they align with best practice in terms of policy. And again, what does the evidence say? What is the field, the research in the field telling us? And there are certainly a number of recommendations around policy. There are recommendations and components of policy that could be an entirely, its own webinar. But really what it comes down to is a balance of what's required with best practice. And so in our inventory, when we assess policy, we look at three elements: the written, enforced, and adjudicated, how policy is written, enforced, and adjudicated. And we look at specific elements of policy, but really when it comes down to it, we're looking at the development and implementation of policy. And so whether it is alcohol or sexual assault policy, it's very much about what it is that's required, what it is that is best practice, balancing those two. Here are some of the components, as I said, and you'll notice some overlap here, that some are exclusively one or the other, but really many of these overlap between Clery or Title IX and those found in the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act, or EDGAR, Part 86, which is compliance around alcohol and other drug prevention. And the Clery requirements here, also to point out, are very much about how we implement policy and not as much about content. So for the purposes of the discussion, we're going to really look more broadly. I'll be speaking to how these roll up into either the development of policy and or the implementation of policy. So in developing, it's necessary to understand what evidence exists. And again, as I mentioned, when we look at development, these are the three areas that I'm really going to focus on in terms of the development piece, because this is where campuses are asking or looking for the most guidance. And first of all, when we think about evidence-based, this is really kind of critical, well, especially critical, this conversation, because this is where a number of campuses are challenged, particularly by others on the campus, that, policy is ineffective, or it doesn't work, or, that it's not aligned with what we believe from, a developmental process that is helpful to our students. But really we need to see that it really does, it really is supported by evidence. And we can start by looking at the relationship between state level policy and student alcohol use, which notes that, students attending college in states where there are more alcohol control policies are less likely to engage in binge drinking. And although this particular study is identifying the relationship between state level policies and student drinking, it does point to the need to be working to ensure effective policies that limit access to inexpensive alcohol, which, as we mentioned earlier, is an area that only about 7% of campuses have prioritized. So part of this process includes an honest assessment of what is happening off campus and what is required in order to create collaborative and effective approaches to address student behavior. Interestingly, there is even more recent research that's identified policies aimed at reducing excessive drinking among adults has also impacted youth drinking. So again, this second study, second of these two studies, again says that even if we're not targeting youth drinking, any policies identified to improve access and availability for anyone regardless of age is going to have an impact on youth, adolescent, and college-age drinking. The second study harkens back to Bob Salsa's earlier comment on the need to focus on enforcement of policy. When you compare alcohol-related outcomes, as you see here, for various prevention strategies, everything from policy enforcement up to alcohol-free strategies, you see how important the role of policy is, particularly when paired with enforcement. And that's really the key here, the key finding from this study. Looking at the reduction in alcohol availability has a significantly greater impact on negative consequences. So to the extent that we can limit availability both on and off campus, we really should be doing what we can to ensure that that happens. And that, again, both on and off campus, because on campus we're thinking about things such as pubs and maybe perhaps athletic events, and it's not, about how, it's really about what is the role that alcohol plays and what is the prominence of it when we are deciding on policies and looking at the level of availability and the level of access and the level or the role that alcohol plays or is perceived to play, at least certainly by students. Which leads us, speaking of the athletic events, I do want to drill down a bit on this specific topic because I want to look at how the evidence should inform conversations about game day alcohol sales. And the reason I'm touching on this particular issue is because of the attention it's receiving most recently and requests that we again have received for research to make the case for why this is, why not to go back on these bans that have previously been in place to serve alcohol at athletic events. So we do know from the research that increases in alcohol availability leads to increases in consumption, which in turn leads to more problems. And so here you see in 2015, 75% of college stadiums did not sell alcohol. And among schools who've completed our alcohol diagnostic, 77% didn't sell alcohol in stadiums. So first thing to understand is that there really is still a vast majority of campuses that are not moving in this direction. Still, there really is increasing pressure to change this, so I want to take a closer look at the evidence that's being used to argue in favor of selling alcohol, and then what does prevention research really have to say about it? So proponents will point to the number one reason as being revenue. Specifically, it's, they say it's a solution to make up for increased costs required to field athletic teams, which has increased over the years about 40% in the past decade, I believe. And also to address drops in attendance, which many believe is driven by the fact that fans can stay at home and drink while watching the game rather than go to the stadium where no alcohol is available. So the thing is that these studies do not account for drops in attendance due to any other aspects such as poor performance or losing records. So they don't look at those as measures of why attendance may have declined or any other measures for that case. Could be cost of tickets, cost to go to a game, not just the game itself, but even going to an area where it's being hosted, spending the night, et cetera, et cetera. So fans say they want it. However, the majority of survey respondents to these types of assessments are alumni and students themselves, most of whom are underage. So proponents will say also it will reduce chugging before entering the stadium, kind of along those same lines as the previous note here. But the thing is if alcohol is going to only be served to of-age fans, which we would assume that would be the case, chugging is still going to occur among underage students. So, this is not going to address the chugging issue among 3/4 of the population who are potentially attending these games. And then the last is incidents have reportedly decreased outside of stadiums that have started selling beer. And so a number of different, schools have been used as examples. And so I do want to spend probably the most time here because when someone or when it's raised, the issue is raised that incidents have reportedly decreased, really there's no research to support that in terms of what is happening, not just right outside the stadium, the immediate site of the athletic event, but also elsewhere on campus or in the local community, anything that is being tracked in terms of those, in terms of that behavior. So an examination of data collected between 2000 and 2005 at 25 Division 1A college football programs did find that home games actually led to significant increases in offenses and citations versus other days in the year, especially arrests for liquor law violations and disorderly conduct. So you see a yield of increase of 76 and 41% respectively for these violations. Another study that I think is really important to note, and of particular concern is the relationship to reported sexual assaults on game day. In this study, researchers examined FBI data collected over a 21-year period from agencies that serve 96 colleges with Division I football teams. And through that, they found sharp increases in the number of reported rapes to campus and local police, both during home games as well as away games, although, as you can see, home games saw a much greater increase. If anything, this suggests that we need to do more to ensure the safety of students on game days, and that certainly doesn't involve making alcohol more accessible. And again, this study is done both of these studies were done on campuses not identifying whether or not alcohol was provided, but if we look at the impact that game days have in general, why would we want to mix alcohol into that environment and potentially increase the likelihood of problems, particularly around sexual violence? So if anything, again, I said that this does point to the need to really ask some critical questions and decide where we stand. And if the decision is made to sell alcohol, things that campuses should be considering are things like a no reentry policy, wristbands, additional security, obviously, a limit on the number of drinks sold, the number of or the hours of the drinks being sold, so not after a certain time in the game, and then the limit on the location of sales. So sales only in areas where they're likely to be where students are not likely to sit, so not in student areas or not easily accessible to students, or even areas where they're not as visible. So really important to, again, keep these conversations based in what do we know from the literature and the research, and then to kind of challenge what we may know, and if the decision, again, is ultimately made, to be really thoughtful around the best practices to help really ensure the safety of our students. When we think of how our policies align with institutional mission, I think one of the best examples I've seen comes out of the College of St. Scholastica. So St. Scholastica's Benedictine heritage highlights 5 values: community, hospitality, respect, stewardship, and love of learning. So it's really easy to see how policy can align with their mission, and I think most campuses, and there are other great examples of this, and a number of campuses are able to really align with mission, but it's also carried over into the response, which I think is really helpful, in that when responses to conduct violations, or with responses to conduct violations, they consider both the behavior and whether or not that behavior violated one of the 5 values. And then if so, is there an additional sanction that can be imposed? So if an alcohol violation occurs that also resulted in a lack of respect to another community member, there are potentially 2 responses that the university might take, one in which the student's individual behavior is addressed, and one in which the student has to make restitution to the individual or entity that was disrespected. So I think as we discuss policy, we need to make sure it is echoed throughout the process. So not just in what we say, but can we actually operationalize the institutional mission? How do we reflect what is written and how we hold our students accountable? And I am also, I'm a firm believer in kind of looking to stories from other institutions. And in speaking about policies that align with institutional mission, I think that at the heart of institutional mission is the academic mission. And here are 2 stories that really capture what it means to truly lead. So tying in with that institutionalization that Rob mentioned, when it comes to creating environments that prioritize student safety, regardless of how unpopular a decision might be, it's important to see examples of leadership that kind of stand above that. So the first story is familiar to many people and involves a decision by Bucknell's president to cancel their very popular house party weekend. And this is a great example of an event that was originally created to highlight the Greek community and their community and their contributions, actually, to Bucknell. So initially it was kind of a celebration of the Greek community. Over the years, it really became an altogether different event, and it really morphed into something that was really a challenge for the president. And the story behind the headline, which is that it was ultimately this celebration was canceled, but the story behind that is that in 2010, when the president arrived, he observed, and he sat back and kind of watched this event unfold and watched some of the behavior that was associated with it and the challenges and the the resources and time and energy that were spent on some really negative behaviors by the students. And then in 2011 and 2012, he worked with student leaders and a number of others to encourage safety and responsible behavior, and he dedicated significant resources to those attempts. He worked with a number of groups, as you see here, IFC, student government, put new communications into place, new judicial proceedings, went to great pains to point out the concerns were unrelated to the Greek community, and in fact this event turned out to be doing more harm to the Greek community. That's really how he framed it. And in 2012, unfortunately, he writes that he observed probably the worst of what he had seen since arriving: 15 hospitalizations, high BACs, drug violations, damaged property, et cetera, et cetera. And if you read if you go to the website or you look this up, you can see all the details of this particular event and what he pointed out during his 48 hours of house party weekends in 2012. And so the Board of Trustees issued a resolution in support of whatever steps the administration needed to take. And so this was really a decision that was shared by a number of different constituencies on campus, and again, born out of a process that he put in place to try and solve the problems before making a sweeping decision. He spoke to his greatest concern when he made the decision to cancel it by saying that the purpose of a university is to help students strive to do their very best, but that this event really encouraged folks to be at their worst. Perhaps the greatest challenge he faced was when asked if he was concerned about possible problems in the face of canceling this event and how those would arise without the benefit of university oversight. He said, yes, I do have that concern, but I do also know that we've sent a message in almost every way that this is almost like suspended reality, and we've essentially said this is okay and we can no longer do that. So down the road a bit, here's another great example of kind of an upstream approach to addressing sexual violence. And this was in May. This decision was announced by President Faust to accept a recommendation of their undergraduate dean to bar members of unrecognized single-gender clubs, and that included fraternities, sororities, and what they refer to as finals clubs. And what they did was ban students who participate in those organizations from leadership in official groups and ban them from the ability to be recommended for scholarships. So similar to Bucknell, the dean had been working behind the scenes for a while to try and get these organizations to become co-ed, and a few did, but others refused, and ultimately it came down to the need for a mandate from leadership. And as you can imagine, there has been a great deal of backlash focused mainly on whether or not the institution has the right to create such a policy, and certainly those are ongoing conversations. But it's important to understand that behind the headlines, this was not a uniform decision. There was just a blanket decision that was made after, again, no information to help support or inform the decision. It was made after, for example, after a university task force had assessed sexual assault and concluded that these all-male clubs were perpetuating a harmful sexual culture. It was after a survey of sexual misconduct identified that female students who engaged with these clubs were more likely to experience sexual assault. And those findings were disputed by representatives for those clubs. But really what it came down to, this policy was framed chiefly about issues of inclusion, not about sexual assault. And really the president kept it at that level and kept it framed in that context. President Faust did, however, note that sexual misconduct is related to issues of inclusion and gender attitudes, which we know from the research to be true. But I think it's really important to reinforce that the president, kept this really at that level of, around issues related to inclusion, even though ultimately they do contribute to sexual assault, but wanted to make sure this was a bigger issue, that the bigger issue was clear, and identifying that participation in groups because of gender, or barring students from participation because of gender, encourages a form of self-segregation that undermines the promise offered by Harvard's student body and certainly does not prepare students for life after college, in her mind. So again, two decisions from leadership that took a lot it took a lot to make that were difficult decisions, done in the face of what they knew would be significant backlash, but certainly at the heart of it was information that they used to inform those decisions based on what they believed to be the best for their students. Finally, as we're talking about conversations, there really is no shortage of resources to inform these conversations, particularly around sexual assault. We have a tool, the EverFi, the Alcohol Policy Checklist. You can go to certain websites, ATICSA, Association of Title IX Administrators, SAFER, the Center for Changing Our Campus Culture. There's really tremendous resources out there, certainly more than I have here, but would highly recommend that as you are looking to create the actual policies themselves, that you look to best practice, you look to recommendations, and to see what is out there in terms of model policies. Don't be afraid to tap these resources as you consider policies for your campus. So while we could devote the entire session, probably beyond to considerations for policy development, I also want to make sure that we devote some time to the implementation process. And so in this section, I want to touch on some of the challenges that have been expressed to us by our partner institutions, specifically around enforcement, adjudication, and sanctioning. Before we look at some of those areas, I want to preface this with some information based on recent attention and renewed focus on accountability of federal requirements. I think this is really critical to these conversations. And the reason I'm starting this implementation conversation here is because federal mandates around Clery, Title IX, and DFSCA are very strongly tied, if not exclusively tied, to implementation. So how we communicate our policies, carry out our policies, and consistently enforce whatever processes we have decided on. So not as much the what, but the how. To begin, some of us who've been doing this work for a while have seen firsthand the lack of oversight that has occurred with regards to compliance with EDGAR, DFSCA, or EDGAR Part 86. And however, that's starting to change, and the reason is because of Title IX. So after a pretty negative report was filed in 2012, noting that there was no assurance that institutions of higher ed are in compliance with Part 86, around that same time, of course, Title IX was making headlines. And so this really shined a light on the accountability challenge. And when it was acknowledged that Title IX compliance really could not be addressed without attention to DFSCA. And I know there are many campuses listening that can tell you from firsthand experience that this truly is happening. The most recent example of how campuses have fallen under scrutiny was in the news just last week, when Penn State made headlines because the Department of Ed issued a substantial fine, $2.4 million to be exact, in response to one of the most detailed Clery reviews ever undertaken. And in addition to multiple Clery violations, you can see in this last bullet, there is a specific reference to the lack of compliance with the Drug-Free Schools and Communities Act. And, let me be clear that this is not about Penn State specifically. I could replace this logo with any number of campus insignias, and I think it's important to note that Penn State has already begun to address many of these issues and is doing, what they can to comply. But what was, I think, critical to this story, and certainly if you go online and look this up, you can look up the details of the review and the findings and the response from the institution, and then the Department of Ed's response to that and their expectations that they have for the institution. But I think probably the best quote in a Huffington Post article noted that these failures to comply, these discrepancies, these issues, they were really more an institutional obligation rather than a police or security department responsibility alone. That was really what it came down to. So again, that institutionalization and noting the importance of having institutional buy-in for our policies and procedures and ensuring that we are not only doing what's best for our students, but we are compliant with those expectations set forth by a number of different federal agencies. So if you're looking for a blueprint to help inform some of these conversations on your campus, look no further than public records. And again, Here's a website here, and on the slides that will be shared later, another website is going to be included as well. I want to look a little more closely at Penn State's DFSCA violations, but first I do want to touch on another case that made headlines a few years ago in regards to their handling or rather mishandling of sexual assault. And again, this is not about a specific institution, but what can be taken away from their experience. Many of you are familiar with the book Missoula, which discussed how several sexual assault cases were mishandled by the town where University of Montana is located. The book highlighted the challenging relationship between local law enforcement and campus officials and the competing priorities that they face when dealing with campus sexual assault. And so while much of the attention was focused on processes relating to how campus and local authorities responded to allegations of sexual assault and collaboration, the Department of Justice and the Department of Ed ultimately identified a number of issues with the university's compliance around Clery and Title IX, and in which the university did agree to take specific steps to resolve. And this is what they indicated, is that they would revise policies, procedures, and investigative practices to provide prompt and equitable resolutions, that they would adequately investigate or respond to allegations of retaliation. That was a really critical part of these cases, that they would take sufficient action to fully eliminate a hostile environment based on sex, and that they would ensure that Title IX coordinators received adequate training to implement the efforts effectively, and they needed to revise the university's notice of non-discrimination to adequately inform students that sex discrimination is prohibited. So these were all specifically laid out in the letter in the Department of Justice expectations, and that in the agreement that University of Montana Missoula agreed to as a result of these investigations. So in addition to the Clery violations, the last several pages of that 250-page report issued by the Department of Ed, again, highlighted violations specifically related to compliance with DFSCA or EDGAR Part 86. And those violations included a failure to conduct a substantive biennial review of its drug and alcohol abuse prevention program, specifically between the years 1998 to 2011. I think it's helpful if you do get a chance to review that report, that you see what it was that Penn State provided as evidence of following the requirements, and to see what the response was from the Department of Ed, what their response was in terms of saying, that was not sufficient. I think that's a really helpful part of that report. And also, they pointed out its failure to include as part of its drug and alcohol abuse prevention program an accurate and complete written description of the legal sanctions when they were doing notification, and a description of health risks associated with use of illicit drugs and abuse of alcohol. One thing that stood out for me was the institution's belief that providing the annual security report, which is a Clery requirement, that providing that report was that they were indicating was sufficing for the annual notification, to which the Department of Ed said, no, that is not sufficient. So let's look a little closer at policy enforcement now and the role of consistency. Over the years, research has pointed to the fact that inconsistent enforcement does send a mixed message by allowing students to interpret acceptance of certain behaviors, and can also be construed from a legal standpoint as failure to take reasonable measures. So very important to keep in mind. The best example of this is found in law enforcement, and the example I've referenced in several prior policy discussions that many may be familiar with is the idea of fixing broken windows. And that comes from Kellig and Wilson back in 1982, and they referenced, the fixing broken windows theory, that the premise is that a broken window signals that no one cares, so if the small things are left unaddressed, they become big things. And so it was tested out originally in the field of law enforcement. It has some controversy around it with Chief Bratton in LA, who decided to focus on minor crimes as a way to reduce the major crimes. And even though there were some positive outcomes, still, again, some controversy around that approach for a number of reasons. However, in this study, which is several years old, but this idea was applied to residence halls. And it really, although as I said, several years old, has been shown to have similar impact as schools have applied this theory on their campuses. So in this case, for this study, the compound violations declined in URI residence halls when simple violations were consistently enforced by RAs. Many campuses have done similar studies, found similar findings. They have also shared that data with their RAs. They have shared with RAs that in residence halls where there are more problems, that those halls tend to be where student staff have not enforced policies early on or enforced policies consistently, and so they end up spending the second semester really struggling and with very poor community engagement. Whereas halls that have enforced upfront and consistently in first semester have fewer policy violations second semester, have higher rates of job satisfaction, et cetera. And these, again, this is data that is shared back to the RAs to help them understand their role in not just not just in enforcement, but how that enforcement then contributes to the broader community in the residence halls. So disseminating policy to students, faculty, and staff is certainly an expectation of both Clery and DFSCA, but doing this effectively is also important. And this 2015 study highlights the importance of not just communicating policy, but being thoughtful about how we deliver it. This looked at communication of sexual assault policy specifically. Investigators used 7 items to assess knowledge and help seeking related to sexual assault across 5 groups. A control group that received policy information only, a group that was asked to review an online video, students who read the policy in class, one that read the policy and then discussed it, and then one that received all interventions. The researchers' findings indicated that all students showed some attitude and knowledge change, and what they said is this is likely the result of new Violence Against Women and Clery Act amendments that went into effect. And so campuses have been presenting a variety of information around sexual assault policies beyond intervention. So the likelihood of students recollecting and understanding campus policies increased just simply as a number of different delivery methods increased. So in other words, it may not be enough to read students the campus policies in class or ask them to watch a video, but you need to have some kind of activity such as a facilitated discussion to help students process that information in a way that will give them a more in-depth understanding of the policy. So we didn't show, I'm not including information around policies here, although those did have a number of changes as well. And here we're looking at changes in confidence about seeking help and resources. And as you see, the pre and post-test knowledge, knowledge, again, speaking to the fact that because all students receive some type of policy information in the control group, they did receive it. But again, you see that level of increase from pre to post test is greatest among those who had at least 2, maybe potentially 3, certainly 2 to 3, or even all, especially all these interventions. So the more often they heard about it in different ways really indicates the need to go beyond presenting that information or just making it available to them. And to really think about how to encourage students to seek help from individuals through a variety of processes. One thing to point out, I do want to point out, by the way, in backing up, is that less than 30% of the students who were sent an email to invite them to watch an online video reported that they watched the online video. So that could also be the reason why there's lower there. And I think what that really points to is the need for administrators to mandate such tasks. So it's one thing to do it in a class, and it's another, again, to send something that, to give students a choice of whether or not to spend time watching something. So from facilitated research focus groups, students report that when they're asked by their campus administrators to complete online programs or videos, that they're not as engaged if they're not mandated. So we do need to make sure that these policies are delivered in an engaging manner and that they hold students accountable for obtaining this knowledge. So In confidence in finding information, again, we found there were similar findings in that the greatest increases were seen for those students who received more interventions. And certainly that is kind of the takeaway from all this. And there were even, again, more, a greater change even when we looked more specifically, or when the study looked more specifically at the actual policies and processes for reporting. So in many ways, in every area that they assessed, they did see this increase in knowledge based on how the information was delivered. I also will point out that to help communicating policy, I do want to remind folks that you can include, those of you who are using Alcohol EDU and Haven, that you can include links to specific policy and electronic signatures for both of those courses for receiving policy. Again, that is for first-year students only, and we know that we need to be delivering policy much more broadly across campus. A great example, as we're talking about this, that I did want to call out, again, many campuses have really effective methods for how they communicate and how they're thoughtful about communicating policy, but I do want to look at this example from American University, who, on their search engine, when you type in sexual assault into the search field here, what you find is what comes up is, regardless if it's sexual assault or sexual misconduct or rape or whatever the terminology, that what it brings you to at the top of the page, regardless of what other information, if it's even remotely related, you see sexual harassment party and sexual assault resource pages. It takes students directly there. It's right at the top. It really just is a great example of thinking through how students access information and about how important it is to direct students to resources on sexual assault policies and responses, knowing where they look and where they spend their time. Looking at the role of disciplinary sanctions now, I think one of the most challenging and least studied areas of policy is policy implementation is ensuring that our adjudication efforts have an impact. And highlights from one study provide some helpful considerations for how we approach policy and really helps identify the impact of some common alcohol sanctions. And it comes to us from the National Judicial College, Association for Student Conduct Administrators, and the Century Council. So they combined do this study, I think, every other year. And the results highlight responses from more than 600 students on multiple campuses who were adjudicated for policy violations such as underage drinking and public intoxication, to name a few. So when it comes to effectiveness, what we see is that 57% of students identified alcohol assessments and 62% identified treatment programs as being effective in changing behavior. So of course, self-reported. But in this study, by the way, most institutions were not collecting blood alcohol levels or blood alcohol concentration, but this also provides support for doing so in an effort to justify an assignment of an assessment or treatment. So that's one thing to think about. But interestingly, when it comes to the type of sanctions being issued, assessment and treatment are the least used. An important thing to note, when you look at the distribution of sanctions here, it is not similar to the distribution of severity of sanctions. So in other words, assessments and treatment were not the least used because the incidents were less severe. They were just the least used overall in general. And so those identified again as most effective by students were the least used by institutions. And interestingly, 65% said that involvement with the criminal justice system would deter them from repeating the behavior. So, not necessarily deterrent initially, but certainly a deterrent in terms of repeat behavior. And you see, again, low sanctions for police involvement or criminal justice involvement. Also, for those who are wondering whether or not parental notification is effective, here is what this study showed. First, 55% of schools in this study had some type of parental notification policy, and of those who did, nearly 50% of students that reported that it deterred them from, again, repeating their behavior. A few things stood out in this study. First, simply assigning sanctions without any follow-up really is not a very educational experience for the student. That was a clear finding. Institutions that miss the opportunity to follow up are really passing on a teachable and potentially very valuable moment. Students really need to process the experience to make meaning of it, otherwise it is just punishment. And I think that's why assessments and treatment programs, anything that gave students an opportunity to engage one-on-one with someone else and kind of talk through some of these challenges were really helpful. And then looking at the deterrence for repeat violations, things like involvement with the criminal justice or parental notification. You see here this quote from a student: notification of my parents is what has deterred me from violating the alcohol policy. But again, that is only going to be effective if that is effectively communicated. If students don't know there is a parental notification or don't understand that policy, then it isn't going to be a deterrent. I think another part of this study really showed how many students were unaware of the policy prior to violating it, or understandably could say they were not aware until they violated the policy. But regardless, even if we're providing that, there's no guarantee that they're reading it or comprehending it. To speak to that previous study around sexual assault policy, if students are not internalizing this policy, or if it's being provided to them at a time where there is tons of information coming at them about numerous other responsibilities on campus, particularly as they arrive on campus, we are not doing them a service. We're doing them a disservice if we are saying that this is one and done, this is when they get that information, and we expect them to really hold on to that and internalize it, and also understand why there is a need for policy and why there is a need for the institution to respond to violations of policy. So I want to finish up with looking at some opportunities to be collaborative in our sanctions and to be creative. So if we're going to truly help students to understand and encourage personal development among students through the conduct system and through our response to policy violations, we need to be really thoughtful about our approach, making sure that they're not only creative, but that they provide opportunities to engage stakeholders outside student affairs. And I think that's important as we start to think about the siloed aspect of student affairs and the inability of students to kind of make those connections, that what they do outside of the classroom is connected to inside. It is part of their overall experience. So it is not, students are great at compartmentalizing between academics and life outside of the classroom. But students don't wake up in their residence hall or their off-campus apartment, or even in their home if they're at a community college, and say, okay, I'm going to go from my residence life area to my academic area, and if I need help signing up for housing, now I'm going to go to my student affairs area. We have set up a campus, as many leaders are starting to talk about, that is not consistent with how students think about their life on campus. And so sometimes it's up to us in many ways to help them make those connections. And these are some great examples about how that can be done. First is AOD Plus, and this is a program that is being implemented by this senior program coordinator at Duke University, David Mallon. And he first had success with this at Penn State. And Erin, my colleague, will be getting into a few more details when she speaks to programming, particularly in terms of outcomes. But I thought it was worth mentioning here as well. And this is an option for students who have gone through previous interventions and are now at risk of being suspended. The goal of the program is to use collective campus experiences and resources to enhance the student's well-being, with a goal of redirecting a student's energy into their personal well-being. In other words, unrelated to their alcohol use. So after several weeks of engagement with campus and community partners like the Campus Recovery Center, Student and Family Services, local magistrate, career services, student activities, these are all groups that have gotten involved. These students give a capstone presentation that, and most importantly, Paul assesses the presentation of the program using pre and post surveys, informal observations. He really looks at the quality of the capstone presentation, longitudinal data. And in terms of aligning with institutional mission, this program really hits the mark. If you look at the statement, that Duke seeks to engage the mind, elevate the spirit, and stimulate the best effort of all who are associated with the university, as David says, how better to do this than to help students become the best version of themselves? I really love that quote from him. Villanova has also found a way to help students identify how their behavior has implications beyond their social life. So Following a 2-year study called The State of Alcohol at Villanova, it included participation, this process included participation from several faculty members, and one of the recommendations focused on how to engage academics in prevention efforts. And a number of faculty kind of came up in support of this idea, this approach, which is for students who have an alcohol-related medical transport, as before having to meet with the dean first, Dean Paul Pugh, when that student meets with the dean, they also are required to meet with the assistant academic dean of their program. And so that student in that meeting discusses the impact of alcohol, or the dean does actually discuss the impact of alcohol on academics, and has just a simple one-pager with talking points provided by Paul Pugh and Stacy Andes on the research connecting alcohol and academic outcomes. And if there are financial implications such as ROTC scholarships or grants, the student must also engage with a representative from Student Financial Aid. And as I learned recently, they have added one more piece to this opportunity, or this process, in that if the student is an athlete, they also will be meeting with the coach and or director or assistant director of athletics as well. So again, two really great examples of how to help students think beyond the implications of social life, and also engaging the rest of the community as well, which is always going to be helpful to those of us who are doing this work in helping to gain support and buy-in from a greater number of stakeholders on campus. So to finish off, I will try to answer again, why does policy matter? I'm sure it's not lost on anyone here, but beyond requirements and compliance, let's think about how policy is supported by the process of prevention in the context of what you've heard at this point. So the development and implementation of strong policies really can only occur when there's a strong commitment from the school's top leadership. In addition, when we create comprehensive and integrated policies, it requires an organized and participatory process and critical processes born out of assessment and evaluation and strategic and thoughtful planning. And it's based on a comprehensive approach to student substance use that takes into account the interplay of individual, school, and community factors. So what we know of as social ecological model or a public health model, to make sure that we affect the scope and consequence of the problem. And again, you'll hear next month that evidence-based programs can include evidence-based responses to policy violations, which I just very briefly touched on at the end. Ultimately, we really need to begin thinking about policy as the backbone of effective prevention, and that speaks volumes about who we are and what we expect of our community, not just in spirit, but also in words and action. We are in the midst of multiple challenges which require a system of accountability. Words matter because they lay out what we expect from members of our community, and how we follow through on that really will shape the role of policy in keeping our students safe and creating those environments where they can succeed in a way that they can see their potential fully realized. So that is ultimately what we are trying to establish, and what we are trying to make sure we create for our students, for our community. So with that, I will leave us, and thank you again for joining us today. Thank you for all the work that you do and continue to do to help support your students in creating safe and healthy communities on your campuses. Please do contact me if you have additional questions. My email is kimberly@everfi.com, and that is Kimberly, Kimberley. That information will be available with the recording and the slides that you will receive. Thank you so much.